So imagine you're walking into a room, right? And you are out to meet your identical twin for the absolute first time in your entire life.
Which is already a wild scenario.
Exactly. I mean, you're both in your late 40s. You were separated shortly after birth in Trinidad. And your paths could not have been more different. You were taken to Germany, raised by your grandmother as a strict Catholic, and you even eventually joined the Hitler Youth.
Right, while the other twin stayed in the Caribbean.
Yeah. He was raised by his Jewish father, spent part of his youth working on an Israeli kibbutz. I mean, you've literally never exchanged a single letter. So you'd think your lives would be complete total opposites.
You really would.
But then you open the door, and you were both wearing the exact same blue double-breasted suit.
I mean, it sounds like the setup to a movie, but it's entirely real. This is the story of Oscar Storr and Jack Youth, which is probably one of the most famous cases to ever come out of the Minnesota twin studies.
And it wasn't just the suits. Like, they both showed up wearing identical wire-rimmed glasses. Yeah, they both sported the exact same style of mustache. And when researchers started observing them, they realized both men loved spicy foods. They both dipped buttered toast in their coffee.
It's so specific.
Right, and they both had this incredibly specific, weird habit of flushing the toilet before using it.
Okay, that is strange.
But here is the absolute kicker. They both shared a bizarre joy of surprising people by loudly sneezing in crowded elevators.
Which perfectly sets up exactly what we're trying to unpack today in this deep dive. Because when you see two men, separated by an ocean and two radically different cultures, sharing a penchant for elevator sneezing, you really have to confront the ultimate nature versus nurture debate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, how much of your personality is hardwired into your biology and how much is shaped by your environment, your thoughts, or, just your sheer willpower.
Right, because usually we just assume our quirks, our habits, our sense of humor. We assume it's this deeply personal tapestry we've woven ourselves.
Yeah, I agree.
But if an identical twin you've never met has the exact same tapestry, it begs the question, if personality is physical, if it's inherited like eye color or height, where exactly does it live in the body?
Well, for a long time, that was a complete mystery. But modern neuroscience has actually given us some incredible insights.
Okay, what kind of insights?
So when researchers put people into fMRI brain scanners and asked them to evaluate adjectives about themselves or just think freely about their own traits, they see this really consistent, elevated activity in a very specific area.
Which is?
The medial prefrontal cortex. This region right behind your forehead. It basically seems to be the neurological home base of self-referential thought.
Okay, so let me unpack this. Is the prefrontal cortex basically like the CEO of the brain? Because I'm thinking about that famous case of Phineas Gage.
Oh, right, the railroad worker.
Yeah, the foreman from the 1840s who had that massive, 3-foot-long iron rod blown right up through his cheek and out the top of his skull.
It's a brutal story.
It is. And it completely destroyed his prefrontal cortex. But he survived?
He miraculously survived, yeah. But the medical records from his doctor show his personality entirely shifted.
Right. He went from being a highly responsible, well-liked foreman to being completely irreverent, profane, and just super impulsive.
Exactly.
So if the prefrontal cortex is the CEO, when Phineas Gage lost his, did all the impulsive employees just start running the factory floor?
That is actually a highly accurate way to visualize it. The prefrontal cortex acts as the great integrator.
Okay.
It takes all these emotional impulses from deeper in the brain, balances them against social rules and long-term goals, and then it coordinates your responses.
So it's keeping everything in check.
Yeah, but what's really fascinating here is that there isn't just one single, personality spot that the iron rod destroyed.
What do you mean?
Well, personality is about how different brain areas coordinate. For instance, brain imaging shows that thinking about your hopes and aspirations lights up slightly different networks in the prefrontal cortex than thinking about your duties and obligations. So it's this intricate, integrated system.
Okay, that makes sense. But if this system is biological, how much of it is actually inherited?
Oh, very heavily. The twin studies show that intelligence has a heritability of roughly 60 to 70%.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
70% for intelligence. So if my biological parents aren't traditionally book smart, I'm just biologically capped. What about education or reading a ton of books or, I don't know, just trying really hard?
I get why you'd ask that. It's a common misconception, but heritability doesn't mean your personal fate is 70% locked in stone.
Okay, so what does it mean?
Heritability refers to how much of the differences between people in a large group can be attributed to genes. It basically sets the baseline. Think of it as the foundation of a house.
Okay, I like that.
Your environment, your education, your diet, your experiences, that determines how the house is actually built and furnished.
So the genes just give you the plot of land and the concrete.
Exactly. But even things you'd assume are purely environmental, like, say, political or religious beliefs,
Wait, those have a genetic component?
yeah, they have a heritability of 30 to 40%
That is wild.
because they are built on inherited tendencies, like how open you are to new experiences or how much you crave structure and order.
Okay, so the hardware is in the brain, and a lot of the blueprint comes from our genes. But, like, I can't put my coworkers in an MRI machine to figure out why they act the way they do.
Probably HR wouldn't like that.
Right. And I definitely can't ask for their DNA. So how did psychologists actually start measuring these biological symptoms in everyday people?
Well, they realize that if you want to understand personality, you first need a common language to describe it. So, back in the 1930s, researchers literally went through the English dictionary.
The whole dictionary.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
And they found 18,000 words that referred to human behavioral characteristics.
That is like nearly 5% of the entire dictionary. But 18,000 traits is completely unmanageable. I mean, you can't evaluate someone on 18,000 different scales.
Precisely. So they used this mathematical technique called factor analysis to shrink that massive list down.
I've seen that term a lot in the research, but how does factor analysis actually work in this context?
Think of it as looking for words that always travel together in a pack.
Okay.
So if a person describes themselves as talkative, statistically, they are highly likely to also describe themselves as outgoing, loud, and sociable.
Right. They all kind of mean the same vibe.
Exactly. Factor analysis is just the statistical math that clumps those highly correlated words into a single bucket.
Got it.
And over decades, psychologists argued endlessly about how many buckets there were. Some said 2, some said 16. But today, the universal scientific consensus has settled on 5 massive buckets, which are known as the Big Five.
The famous Big Five. So that's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Yes. And they cover almost the entire spectrum of human behavior.
Just run through them really quick for me.
Sure. Openness measures how much you crave novelty versus routine. Conscientiousness looks at self-discipline and organization.
Right.
Extroversion is whether you draw energy from crowds or if you need solitude to recharge. Agreeableness is about compassion and cooperation versus suspicion. And neuroticism measures emotional volatility, like how easily you experience negative emotions like anxiety or anger.
And these are pretty universal, right?
Extremely. These 5 dimensions have been validated across wide varieties of cultures, ages, and even in some animal species.
That makes perfect sense for categorizing behavior. But how do we actually test for these traits? Because I know researchers developed something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
The MMPI, yes.
Right, the MMPI. And it uses an incredibly strange approach called the criterion keyed method.
Yes. The MMPI is wildly counterintuitive because it doesn't rely on psychological theory to build its questions. It relies entirely on blind data.
Right. So instead of asking logical questions like, do you feel sad? They just gave hundreds of completely random true-false statements to 2 different groups.
Exactly.
Things like, I daydream very little, or I have never done anything dangerous for the thrill of it. And one group was normal, and the other was a psychiatric group, like patients diagnosed with severe paranoia or schizophrenia.
And they only kept the questions where the 2 groups answered differently?
They didn't care what the question asked, only that it statistically separated the 2 groups.
Exactly.
Okay, hold on. I need to wrap my head around this. Let's say there's a statement. I think most people would lie to get ahead.
Okay.
And the data shows that paranoid patients were significantly less likely to answer true to that than normal people. So if I answer true, it actually means I'm less likely to be paranoid.
That's right.
But why wouldn't they just ask me directly if I feel paranoid?
Because if they ask you directly, you might lie. Or, you might just lack self-awareness. The MMPI beautifully bypasses your ability to fake the test, because the questions just don't have obvious right or wrong answers.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if people with schizophrenia consistently answer true to a bizarre statement like, my mother never loved me, and control participants answer false, the researchers don't care what their mothers actually did.
Right, they aren't investigating the mom.
Exactly. They don't care if the statement is factually true. It just matters that people with schizophrenia statistically say true to that specific arrangement of words.
That is brilliant, but also kind of frustrating. I mean, it means we have a test that can accurately identify traits, but we have absolutely no theoretical understanding of why the correlation exists. We just know it does.
Exactly. It describes the what, but it totally ignores the why.
Which is actually super similar to another test I was reading about in the deep dive sources, the Q-sort method,
Oh, yeah?
where instead of comparing you to a psychiatric group, you get about 100 cards with personality statements on them, and you have to sort them into 9 piles, from least like me to most like me.
Right, a forced distribution.
Yeah, but you are only comparing your traits against each other, not against the general public. So putting friendly in your highest pile just means friendliness stands out compared to your other traits, like ambition or tidiness. It maps your internal configuration.
Precisely. But just like the MMPI, the Q-sort is purely descriptive. It's a snapshot of the surface. If we really want to understand the hidden engines actually driving our behavior, the why, we have to wade into the murky, highly controversial waters of Sigmund Freud.
Right, you really can't do a deep dive into personality without talking about Freud's psychoanalytic theory. I mean, he basically proposed that we aren't even the masters of our own minds.
That's the core of it, yeah.
That our behavior is driven by powerful unconscious forces. He divided personality into 3 major systems: the id, the ego, and the superego. And honestly, trying to visualize this, I couldn't help but picture a really chaotic family road trip.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Okay, so the id is a screaming toddler in the backseat. It operates purely on the pleasure principle and biological drives. It wants ice cream immediately, consequences be damned.
Right.
The superego is this strict, highly moral nanny in the passenger seat saying that sugar is a sin and we must suffer to be good. And the ego is the stressed out driver just operating on the reality principle.
That is a fantastic analogy. The ego is the executive. It has to keep the car on the road while mediating the primitive biological demands of the id in the back seat, the moralistic demands of the superego in the passenger seat, and the actual physical realities of traffic outside.
But how does that actually cause our behavior? Like, if the toddler is screaming for ice cream and the nanny is threatening punishment if we stop the driver's stress from that impossible situation, is that what Freud called anxiety?
Precisely. When those 3 forces are in conflict, which is basically almost constantly, we experience intense internal anxiety. And to deal with that anxiety without crashing the car, the ego unconsciously uses defense mechanisms.
So defense mechanisms are essentially the driver just like turning up the radio really loud so he doesn't have to hear the screaming.
Or convincing himself he actually wants to listen to the screaming. Defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological gymnastics we perform to protect ourselves from anxiety.
Okay, let's break some of these down because they explain so much everyday behavior.
Let's do it.
There's repression, which is essentially just shoving the screaming toddler into the trunk so you don't even know they were there. You exclude painful memories or unacceptable desires from your conscious awareness entirely.
Then there is rationalization, where you make up logical, acceptable excuses for impulsive behavior. Like, we needed to stop for gas anyway, so I had to buy the ice cream.
Reaction formation is a wild one.
Oh, definitely.
That's where you conceal a motive by expressing the exact opposite. Like someone who is deeply insecure about their own aggressive impulses becoming this crusading pacifist. Or the driver screaming, "I hate ice cream," just to appease the nanny.
And then there's displacement, which we see in the workplace all the time.
Oh, yeah.
You can't express anger at your terrifying boss, so you come home and redirect that frustrated energy by yelling at your dog or snapping at your spouse. The emotion is real, but the target is displaced.
And because these defenses happen unconsciously, Freudians couldn't just use a true-false test like the MMPI to find them.
No, they'd never show up on a true-false test.
Right, so they developed projective tests like the famous Rorschach ink blots or the thematic apperception test, where they show you an ambiguous picture and ask you to tell a story about it.
With the idea being that since the image has no real meaning, the story you tell must be you projecting your own hidden unconscious conflicts onto it.
Exactly. But all of this brings us to a massive ongoing debate in psychology. Is Freud dead?
It is a fierce academic battle. On one side, you have prominent psychologists like John Kilstrom, who argues that Freud is an absolute deadweight on modern psychology.
Tell us how he really feels.
I know. He points out that classical Freudian theory, things like penis envy, the Oedipal conflict, his really rigid psychosexual stages, are archaic, completely untestable, and have basically zero empirical support. He even argues Freud systematically distorted his own patient data to force it to fit his bizarre theories.
Right, but then on the other side, researchers like Joel Weinberger argue that Freud is very much alive and vibrant.
Yes.
He points out that while the specific, creepy details might be totally wrong, Freud's core concept that unconscious processes drive a massive portion of our behavior and that we carry mental representations of our early relationships, that is now completely mainstream science.
Yeah, if we step back and look at the bigger picture, Freud's real legacy isn't the psychosexual stages. It's the concept that the driver of the car is constantly making compromises, reacting to invisible pressures, without the conscious mind even realizing it. He fundamentally shattered the illusion that humans are perfectly rational creatures.
But not everyone bought into this invisible, untestable, unconscious mind.
Definitely not.
Because in the early 20th century, the behaviorists absolutely hated it. They thought guessing about unseen psychological forces was totally unscientific, so they swung the pendulum entirely in the opposite direction. They claimed our environment completely dictates who we are.
Yes, behaviorism focuses exclusively on observable behavior and how we learn from our surroundings. John Watson, the founder of behaviorism in the U.S., famously made an incredibly extreme claim.
What'd he say?
He said he could take any healthy infant, regardless of their talents, tendencies, or ancestors, and raise them to be absolutely anything, a doctor, a lawyer, a beggar, or a thief, purely by controlling their environment.
Wow. It just paints humans as entirely passive. The behaviorists argued we are just shaped by operant conditioning, which is just getting rewards for good behavior and punishments for bad behavior, and classical conditioning, where we just learn automatic emotional responses.
They viewed humans as highly modifiable, but ultimately just blank slates reacting to stimuli.
Wait, but if we are just perfectly molded balls of clay, shaped entirely by rewards and punishments, how do people raised in terrible, abusive, or impoverished environments ever grow up to be wildly successful?
That's a huge problem for behaviorism.
Right, because they didn't get the rewards, their environment was punishing, so according to strict behaviorism, they should be completely broken.
And that massive flaw is exactly what led psychologist Albert Bandura to spark a cognitive rebellion.
Good for him.
He developed social cognitive theory and introduced a concept called reciprocal determinism. He argued that yes, your environment affects your behavior, but your behavior also changes your environment into a constant two-way street.
So it's not a one-way street.
Exactly. Bandura proved that people aren't passive clay. We possess a crucial element called agency.
Agency. We actually have a say in the matter.
Exactly. Agency trumps environment. We have internal expectations, beliefs, and goals. We actively select the environments we put ourselves in. Furthermore, Bandura showed we don't just learn by being directly rewarded or punished like rats in a maze. We learn by observing others.
Oh, like modeling.
Yeah, you can watch a mentor succeed or a peer fail, figure out the consequences of their actions internally, and choose whether or not to mimic them.
And this cognitive approach also explores how we process the world internally through self-schemas.
Right, Hazel Marcus's work.
Yes. Psychologist Hazel Marcus describes these as mental frameworks that organize how we process information about ourselves. Like, if you deeply consider being a runner as part of your core identity, your self-schema, you will process information related to running much faster.
You're just primed for it.
Exactly. You'll notice running shoes on other people, you'll remember routes better. Your brain physically prioritizes information that matches your schema.
And researchers have found massive cultural differences in how these schemas are built.
Oh, really?
Yeah. North American cultures tend to foster an autonomous self-schema, emphasizing individual choice, uniqueness, and separation from others. But in many Asian cultures, the self-schema is deeply intertwined with relationships, family, and obligations to the social group. Your personality isn't just about what you want, it's about how you fit into the whole.
So the cognitive approach gives us our agency back. It says we are thinkers, not just responders.
Yes.
But then in the 1950s and 60s, the humanistic psychologists came along and felt that even cognitive psychology was too clinical. It missed the soul of what it means to be human.
They wanted to focus on growth.
Exactly. They believed we have this innate, beautiful desire to grow. But that incredibly optimistic view eventually crashed head-on into the grim survival instincts of evolutionary psychology.
It is a fascinating juxtaposition of how we view ourselves. Humanistic psychology, led by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, argues that humans are fundamentally good and motivated by an actualizing tendency. We aren't just trying to avoid anxiety or get a reward.
Hmm.
We actively want to fulfill our highest potential.
Roger said we need unconditional positive regard, which is basically unwavering love and acceptance from our parents to develop a healthy, brave self-concept.
Right.
And Maslow gave us the famous hierarchy of needs, which I always think of like a video game skill tree.
The skill tree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't unlock the top-tier self-actualization superpower until you've successfully cleared the basic baseline levels of securing food, shelter, safety, and love.
That is a great way to think about it.
Okay.
Because once those basic needs are met, you aren't just surviving anymore. You can strive for self-actualization and experience what Maslow called peak experiences.
It's a what? Exactly.
These fleeting moments of profound wholeness, perfection, and harmony with the universe. Humanism focuses entirely on our highest possible ceiling.
Okay, but then evolutionary psychology drags us right back down into the primal basement.
Yes, evolutionary theory strips away the romance entirely. It argues that our personality traits exist today for one simple reason. They increased our ancient ancestors' chances of surviving and reproducing.
The research on how this affects modern behavior, particularly mate selection, is fascinating.
It's very controversial.
Oh, absolutely. But evolutionary theory points out that because human females biologically have to invest far more heavily in each offspring through months of pregnancy and years of nursing, they evolved to seek males who display traits linked to resources and the ability to support and protect them.
Right.
Males, on the other hand, whose optimal biological strategy for passing on genes is just to reproduce as often as possible, evolved to prioritize visual signs of fertility and health, like youth.
And evolutionary psychologists argue this also explains the different triggers for jealousy. Yeah, men, historically facing the threat of paternal uncertainty, which means investing resources in a child that isn't genetically theirs, often show more intense jealousy over sexual infidelity.
Okay.
But women, who face the evolutionary threat of losing the male's resources and protection, often show more distress over emotional infidelity, where the male might abandon them for someone else.
But honestly, doesn't this framework give people a biological excuse for terrible behavior? Like, hey, I can't help cheating on my spouse. It's just my evolutionary mandate to spread my genes.
That is exactly the core of the intense criticism leveled against evolutionary psychology. Critics argue it is highly speculative, nearly impossible to test scientifically, and relies on distant evolutionary history to explain things that are much better explained by modern social and cultural conditioning.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, critics worry it can be used to justify unfair gender roles or bad behavior as simply being natural. Now, evolutionary theorists counter that they aren't endorsing or justifying the behavior. They're simply trying to explain the biological origins of our primal pulse.
It is a massive debate between whether our traits are striving for ultimate human goodness or just base genetic survival. And honestly, looking back at everything we've covered, it is an incredible journey.
It really is.
We started with the bizarre genetic quirks of Oscar and Jack sneezing in elevators. We mapped the prefrontal cortex with Phineas Gage, categorized our traits with the Big Five, dove into the dark waters of Freud's unconscious defense mechanisms, escaped into the agency of cognitive theory, and finally ended up caught between Maslow's human potential and Darwin's evolutionary survival.
And to tie all of those competing threads together, we have to revisit a mind-bending concept from the behavioral genetics research called shared versus non-shared environments.
Yes. This completely shifted my perspective when I was reading the sources.
So the twin and adoption study shows something remarkable. After you subtract the similarities caused by genetics, two children raised in the exact same family, same parents, same house, same rules, same schools, are no more alike in personality than two completely random strangers drawn from the general population.
Wait, so the shared environment, growing up in the exact same house with the exact same parenting style, contributes almost nothing to making siblings similar in personality.
Almost nothing. The environmental factors that actually shape personality are the non-shared ones.
Like what?
The unique experiences, the different peer groups, the individual illnesses or traumas. And the reason for this is a phenomenon called proactive interaction.
Okay, what's that?
As you grow, you don't just passively absorb your environment like Watson's ball of clay. Your unique genotype, your biological blueprint, drives you to actively construct and select your own environment.
Oh, So a child with a genetic predisposition for extroversion will actively seek out friends, join clubs, and organize social events, thereby creating an environment that reinforces their extroversion,
Yeah, great.
while their more introverted sibling in the exact same house seeks out quiet corners and books, creating a totally different environment.
You actively curate the external world to match the internal genes inside you. The environment shapes you, but you choose the environment.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener. If your personality drives you to proactively select your environment, and your environment continuously feeds back and shapes your personality, then by choosing to listen to this deep dive right now, by choosing to spend your time exploring complex ideas and challenging your own perspectives, you aren't just learning about your personality.
That's right.
In real time, you are actively building it. You are steering the ship. You are creating the very environment that shapes the blueprint of who you are. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes you entirely unique.
Even if you do happen to sneeze in elevators.
Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.